So yes, thank you guys for being here and for that lovely introduction. I will tell you guys a little bit more about my background, but really I want to say thank you again. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for the amazing work of my colleagues and peers in a variety of organizations that I've been fortunate to be a part of. So this is not intended in any way as any kind of sponsorship. I'm not working for these organizations. But really I did want to tell you briefly a little bit about each because it will help you understand my context and where I'm coming from when I'm sharing what I'm sharing. So I was fortunate to work with the New England Center for Children for just shy of 10 years, starting out in Boston in their US-based program and very quickly migrating very far east to their Abu Dhabi replica school. So that, if you're not familiar, is in the country of the United Arab Emirates, the less famous cousin of Dubai. Everybody knows glitzy, glamorous Dubai. We're about an hour and a half drive from Dubai, same country. With NEC and ACC in Abu Dhabi, I was afforded so many wonderful opportunities to travel and to work with families and organizations from a number of countries and staff and families from all over the world. So some of those organizations include the Autism Center for Excellence, which is a project that I was a part of in India, Haryana and Gurgaon. I'm very proud of that, and many of my colleagues and now BCBAs are going to be viewing this recording, so hello to everybody in India. I also had the opportunity to live and work in Qatar, which is another small Gulf country. I lived in Doha, where I worked closely with the mother and founder of the Child Development Center, which was kind of first of its kind, providing one-on-one services to families with children with special needs. My additional consultation colleagues, partners are in the UAE. The Hamid Center for Special Needs is also located in Abu Dhabi. My very good friend and partner in crime, Whitney Hamill, went from NEC Boston to NEC Abu Dhabi to India and now runs the Autism Compassion Africa Center in Ghana. She and her colleague, who we trained up at ACE India, are the only two BCBAs in West Africa right now. So really exciting stuff. I do provide supervision to students at the Chicago School, BCBA supervision. That's an online program. It's available online and also FIT. So I have students, supervisees around the world presently as well. And it was really important to me to bring forth diversity of opinion and experience because that's what this talk is all about. So I've been meeting regularly, once, twice a week, with friends and colleagues from all of these places who've been contributing to what we're going to talk about today. Formally and informally over the past 10 years that we've been able to work together. So thank you to all of them, and again to Pat and UBC CIRCA for bringing me here. Okay, so here's a bit of an outline of what we're going to do. Essentially, I want to share with you, some of these lessons learned, and not just my own, staff from a diversity of kind of backgrounds, working with families from all over the place. Obviously, this can be a tricky thing to talk about, so I want to explore some ways that we can have more difficult conversations because I think that's important. And I just need to give credit to the author of this book, Jeremy Williams. Don't They Know It's Friday? Was assigned reading to me at the New England Center for Children once I got the job in Abu Dhabi, and we began our formal training in cultural competency and dissemination. It was funny for me to find the book because, when you find out at ripe old age of 21, you're going to be moving somewhere you've never heard of, and they give you a book. For me, I was like, I gotta read this book, I gotta read all the books, right? So it was kind of funny for me to find it now and think about all that's happened since then. But I sort of borrowed the title and I wanted to kind of that. So, of course, don't they know it's Friday refers to the fact that the working week in the Arabian Gulf is Sunday through Thursday, Friday being a holy day of rest. Of course, having business partners in Boston can make that a little bit tricky because we go back to work on Sunday. Sunday morning in the UAE is Sunday evening in Boston. Kind of some crisscross in communication possible there. So that was the very first lesson of let's realize that we're coming from different places and we're on very different schedules of reinforcement, put it that way, expectations, etc. So let's get started. Why am I here? All of this goes without saying. The world is changing. If anyone is brave enough to look at the news these days, there's an election coming up. That's all I'm going to say about that, but we're constantly bombarded with messages about the other, right? Like whatever that category or group of people is. We hear about this all the time, so I think it's important that there's a message being put forth that is maybe a little bit constructive because the realities are that our clientele are changing, our cities are changing, and this impacts all of us in terms of our professional relationships and our interpersonal interactions. So I personally feel that respectful discourse and training are essential to be able to navigate this sort of change that we're experiencing. Disclaimer, the fine print, right? This is a sensitive subject for everyone at this time and place, I think, more so. Point being, I intend to say nothing to ever offend anyone, but like all of us, sometimes the way we use our words may be received differently by different people. So this is my disclaimer, but I really, I like to put forth to begin sort of the tone that everything I'm expressing to you guys comes from a place of absolute respect for all people. And I think that avoiding these difficult conversations only creates more trouble for everybody. So thank you for excusing anything I may say accidentally that might create offense. Not my intention. And secondly, like I mentioned, I did work with a large number of people in preparation for this event. And so I'm going to be reporting on some shared observations, some discussions, some experiences of my own, but those in no way are reflective of an entire group of people because that's not possible. So I like the working definition that culture is a dynamic process of interaction between individuals or groups of individuals and their environments, right? So I'm going to be working off of that, my experiences and those of my colleagues being potentially probably really unique to us in certain ways. All right, so just a little bit more about me and then we'll talk about more interesting things. But I think it is relevant because, right, this notion of context and culture and all having unique learning histories. 21, so young. Right, they don't spit. Everybody asks, at least not that I know of. They do smell funny though. Anyway, I'm actually from Ottawa, so I am born and bred Canadian. It's funny, identity is a strange thing. I'm doing my doctoral research in this area as well, and I now say I'm Canadian, but, which feels a little funny. Take it or leave it. The fact is, I did grow up in Ottawa in a very diverse community, which was something that I didn't recognize or appreciate. I think it might be natural to take for granted your normal, whatever your normal is, when you're young. But that became apparent to me when I lived in the US, when I lived in the Middle East, that some of my experiences from childhood, such as, being in the 7th grade with girls who were starting to cover and, being in PE class in the second grade with students who are not participating, American language took over there. And students are not participating because it's Eid, they're fasting, it's Ramadan, and Eid overlapping with Christmas, and having all those celebrations together jointly in elementary school was a wonderful experience for me, but it was something I didn't realize was unique to my experience until being in the Middle East amongst my wonderful colleagues, 99.9% of whom came over from the US and had never encountered any of those sorts of things. Nevertheless, I did go to school for my bachelor's degree in Kingston and decided I wanted to pursue more applied work. So I did my undergrad in behavioral psych and had the opportunity to go to California to do an internship in EBA, early intervention, autism, a lot of the sort of common themes, I think, in our field, especially around that time, a lot of funding, a lot of awareness, etc. So that's what led me to the New England Center, the autism path. Ironically, I was offered the opportunity to work in California, and I said, that's way too far. Flash forward to Abu Dhabi, offer a couple of years later, and it seemed like a great idea. I put my name on the list. I didn't think I would get the position. I got the position, and I told my HR guy, 1 year. The contract's 2, but I can do 1 because that's scary. Like, that's really far. Where is that exactly? Show me a map, right? Nevertheless, 10 years later, life unfolded, and it's been wonderful. So in my capacity as a therapist for the New England Center, for the first 3 years I was working in a brilliant model program. Essentially, we were operating on the goodwill and the faith of the local government that believed very strongly in what Meg was doing in Boston, brought us over, gave us some, they call them villas, that's not really a term here, but sort of like homes that were converted into classrooms. We opened up in 2007, with I think about 10 children. We had 3 or 4 classrooms when I got there, 6 to 8 children each, 1-to-1. Each classroom had a VCBA, phenomenally funded, very small. They are now in a massive, gorgeous building, and they provide services all over the country, so rapid expansion. But I really treasure those first few years when nobody really knew how this was going to play out. What did we have to offer? Families didn't know. Should they invest in our services? Should they send their children to this group of specialists? Nevertheless, it was a beautiful experience and one I very much treasured. But after 3 years, I was presented with the opportunity to move to Doha in Qatar to provide private services to one particular family, which I did. I lived there for a year and thought I'd come back to Canada. Decided to go back to Abu Dhabi, pursue my PhD. And in my second part 2 of Abu Dhabi, I was put into a consultation role. So we started up. The thing about the Abu Dhabi program is it was fully funded only for local children. The thing is, if you know anything about the UAE, the population is actually rather minor. Small population of locals to expats, expatriates. I believe in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, it ranges between 85 to 90% expatriates. So that's a very small local population that was able to get access to our services. So we started up the consultation department, and that is kind of where I was afforded these wonderful opportunities to work with emerging special needs centers in the Gulf in general. Kuwait, Qatar. I had colleagues that were working out of Saudi as well, and India. That's what brought me to India, which is a project I'm very proud of as well. I came back to Canada just about a year ago, about to celebrate my 1-year anniversary. My family is here, and it was this time. Nevertheless, I continue to provide supervision for the Chicago School and FIT to students serving abroad, and I'm still very much in touch with my friends and colleagues who are doing wonderful things elsewhere. So that's me, that's my context, but let's go ahead and get into it. One thing I want to say off the bat is I think for a talk like this, it might be expected that someone might show up and say, for this, people from this country, do this, don't do that. For working with people from this country, do this, don't do that. That's actually not what I'm here to do today, because I don't actually think that would be super helpful. We know as behavior analysts that rules create insensitivity to changing environmental contingencies. Katani figured that out decades ago, sort of providing some of the basis for later relational frame theory and acceptance and commitment training as well. We'll get into a little bit more of that, but nevertheless, I want you to try to think about everything I'm sharing with you, or your experiences in terms of diversity of clinical experience. We have what I like to think of as 3 sort of levels that we can be operating on in terms of how we're engaging with different cultures. So, we can talk about accommodations. That's sort of what I was saying before, what to do, what not to do. I like to think of that kind of like compromise. I'm accommodating your culture. Not my favorite way of discussing this. Nevertheless, that is something you'll hear a lot about. If you're fortunate enough to work in a particular setting or with a particular clientele or family or organization for a long period of time, you might start to acclimate. You might start to realize, oh, this is my new normal. I remember the first time I experienced reverse culture shock. It was the strangest thing. I was in London Heathrow Airport, and I was like bombarded by newspapers with really scary headings and so many options. I just wanted to buy a journal and a pen. I had a long time to kill in Heathrow, and there were so many options, and I was so overwhelmed because, in our little market in Abu Dhabi, I'd be lucky if I found 2 options of pens, and most certainly there was only the books that were available. And the cashier is talking to me, can I help you with something? Customer service was sort of something I'd forgotten a little about. I was like, did she tell that I feel weird? Is it normal that she's talking to me? Everybody's talking. Really surreal experience, because that was only 2 years after leaving a lifetime of being Canadian and pretty chatty, I think, sometimes. Nevertheless, I think where I want to focus today is on sort of that 3rd level of acceptance. And that means a lot of things to a lot of people. Certainly there's a lot of discussion in terms of mindfulness and yoga practices. I'm going to stick with what I understand in terms of the acceptance and commitment training, Stephen Hayes and colleagues. We're going to talk about psychological flexibility and acceptance in terms of an open, ongoing awareness of flexibility. So that's where I'm going to be spending a lot of time for today. Okay, so again, just some more terms, because I think these are big ideas and it's important that we get kind of on the same page, at least with what I'm sharing with you. There are a lot of reasons why people do what they do. And I think since time immemorial, people have talked about why people do what they do. So of course there are different theories and philosophies about this. If we look all the way back to Socrates, there were ideas about beliefs about good and bad being internalized. And I think that's probably sort of stuck pretty well, I think, for the majority of civilization. We talk about somebody doing something because they want to, because they believe in it, because they think it's good or bad. That's one way of looking at it. I actually found this article, Lacey 2008, was written by sociologists. So I was interested to note his comments on this as sort of culture is something that motivates us. We do it because we're motivated by our culture to do so. He referred to this as a contrast in terms of what he called Skinnerian approaches, where we say that culture justifies what we have done, if that sort of makes sense. Aristotle got it, I think, a little bit closer in terms of talking about how, you know, experience and relationships shape our biases, but then these biases continue to shape the situations and relationships in which we engage. There was definitely some thought in terms of Aristotle's belief that beliefs were God, they were holy, they were sort of a dualism there in terms of thought and belief being, man's greatest accomplishment, I guess you could say. Nevertheless, I'm going to stick with what Skinner had to say. I am a behavior analyst. You guys are here for CEs, some of you. So Skinner had a lot to say about culture, and I don't think many people know that. I think the behavior analysis that modern day practitioners are more familiar with is sort of the technician, Lovaas style ABA. Nevertheless, Skinner actually had really big ideas about a science of behavior, and specifically he wrote extensively about these in a number of books, but I am referring to Beyond Freedom and Dignity here, which he wrote in 1971. And the reason I chose these quotes, Skinner talks about how cultures are surmised of behaviors which are selected by the environment, just like any other behaviors, except for these behaviors tend to be social in nature, they tend to be passed down verbally, generationally, they evolve based on their context. This can be a tricky way to look at it for some people. There's some opposition here to this idea because we like to take credit for when we do things well, and we want to take responsibility when somebody does something that they shouldn't have done, right? But I think it's important when we're talking about cultural competency that we are mindful of this option, right? I'm not saying you have to believe this, but it's a deterministic way of looking at why people are doing what they're doing, and why do you feel opposed to it? Maybe those beliefs that you're having were also selected by your context, and maybe the things that they're doing were selected by theirs, and that viewpoint has worked really well for me as a professional abroad. So we can get out of the theory stuff now. I do think it's important, but speaking in real modern English, culture is not something that somebody else has, right? Like I said about accommodation, a lot of times it's like you hear people talking about we have to accommodate some other culture, or we have to be accommodating of culture. I don't think that's a very functional way of looking at this. Our behavior is selected by our environments. This includes our covert behavior like thoughts, beliefs, values, etc. I wish I could cite the quote. I don't remember who said it, but my first behavior analyst professor in undergrad said it a lot, so Gary Bernfeld said it. Behavior goes where reinforcement flows, and I think as behavior analysts we often think about this. This is my teacher board here. Environment selecting behavior. This is a dynamic process, so the things that we do change the environments in which we engage. And not only that, but the things that we do change the environments for the people around us, and that selects more behavior. And reinforcement is kind of the tie. Of course, there are some of the things, will governance, etc., aversive control exist, but by and large, I think it's important to remember that this is a circular process, and the world is changing, so it goes around and around. Let's keep that in mind as we go into the practice components. We'll do a real quick time check. Okay. Are there any questions thus far? We are being recorded, but you're welcome, I think, to anything? Okay. So, how does this apply? How do we practice this? What does this mean for, our roles as clinicians or citizens in a changing world? First thing we need to do is we need to look towards the BACB if we're going to address our professional and ethical obligations. I apologize if that's not super clear, but this comes right out of the Compliance Code of Conduct. 1.05 refers to providing services in a language that is fully understandable to the recipient of the services. So that kind of goes without saying, but it's kind of maybe not that inherent if we accept that we're working sometimes with people who speak a different language altogether. And when I say language in this sense, I mean sort of cultural assumptions, beliefs, etc. This also points out that we need to obtain the training, experience, consultation, and/or supervision necessary to ensure the competence of our services or make appropriate referrals. So, if you find yourself clinically in an experience where you are not feeling that you're able to confidently and competently translate those practices, there are always people to reach out to for support. Of course, we don't engage in discrimination, and we should recognize that our personal problems and conflicts may interfere with what we're doing, which I think we're going to talk a lot about self-awareness this morning. But I think that it's handy that the BACB was clever in inserting this component here, because we all have to admit our limitations, and sometimes we may experience tension or conflict that is arising due to no fault of the specific client, but this may be related to our own history, and that has to be something that we are mindful of, and if that's interfering in our work, we need to address that. So I added a little note here. It's been my experience that Western organizations love policies or handbooks for everything, and they're very lengthy, and we have a different history in terms of litigation, legal system, government, etc. So, when we started hiring local staff in the center in Abu Dhabi, we thought we could just print out more copies of our handbooks and turn them over to staff. But the truth is, I don't think that would have been very effective for multiple reasons. One reason, just contextually, being that being overloaded with a number of policies seemed really bizarre to people from various other cultures. And also, what is the relevance, right? I think we can tell people what the policies are, but my note here is, most importantly, we need to show, we need to exemplify, provide rationale. How are we providing our services? Why is that important? Creating a culture as opposed to, here's your handbook, here's the parent handbook. I'm not sure that we would have been as successful if that was the approach, but I do remember being hired in Boston, and probably anywhere else you experience too in the Western world, where first day, sign the forms, here you go. That's sort of how things are done sometimes. So something to keep in mind, that may not be enough, it may not be sufficient if you're engaging with a clientele or an organization or staff people from a different cultural background. Fong, Catagnis, and colleagues, actually Elizabeth Fong and Robin Catagnis at the Chicago School have done some work on developing the cultural awareness skills of behavior analysts. I could spend a lot of time reviewing their work, but I will provide you the citation. What I pulled from it is this definition of cultural identity, because I think it's important and sort of nicely frames up some of the other pieces I wanted to talk to you guys about. So what does that mean? What is someone's cultural identity? Obviously, nobody else can determine what anybody else's cultural identity is, but nevertheless, we refer to people based upon a certain set of distinguishable stimuli. So those stimuli may be their race, their socioeconomic class, age, religion, etc. These are the things that sort of tend to, by and large, make up somebody's cultural identity. Which sort of begs the question, who am I? If I'm going to be going into this culture, that culture, working with this family or that staff person, and I want to be aware of what my own potential biases could be, I need to start asking some questions. And I think that is probably, if there's anything we take away from here today, the most important part is, can we start talking a little bit about this self-awareness piece? So some of those questions might be, how has my environment shaped my behavior? You might realize that something feels unusual, it feels different, it feels just not quite right. But let's think about that. Where did those beliefs come from? Where did my behavior come from? What is my cultural identity? How do I describe myself to other people? And remembering that that's a very personal thing. So other people may ascribe an identity to you that does not relate to how you see yourself. But I think it's important that we recognize that, we all have assumptions. Sometimes they're inherent, they're implicit, we're not even aware that we have them. So starting to think about, what do I assume is just the right way of doing things? What do I assume just is not okay? And certainly when it comes to values, we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. I think stereotypes are something that we need to address in a talk like this. I sort of define stereotypes as broadly stated, overgeneralized beliefs about a group of people or a person. These can be positive, neutral, or negative, but they're not always accurate. We know that, right? But we're still bombarded with all kinds of stereotypic messages. That said, I think that it's important to recognize that stereotyping as a cultural behavior affects all of us, and there may be stereotypes which you endorse. I very much so played up my friendly Canadian while I was traveling abroad, the quirky Canadian, Robin Sparkles. I don't know if you guys watch How I Met Your Mother, but that was me. My friends were all American. Anyways, it was fun, and it was a common language to say, yeah, I like to chat. Yeah, I'm kind of friendly. Sure, harmful, because I determined it was harmful for me. Nevertheless, there are going to be stereotypes about yourself, myself, that maybe you don't agree with, or maybe you just don't like those stereotypes. And I think that's where we need to pay attention, because remember, you're the clinician, you're the professional, you're the one getting this training. You're engaging with the rest of the world that will engage as they will, which means they may make stereotypes or judgments or evaluations about you that you don't love, and that's where I think we need to pay attention. What things are we sensitive about? What's really important to me? Just a few things to kind of get you thinking about, where might you run into some challenges? Again, that self-awareness I'm going to keep coming back to. I did provide you guys with access to a self-report measure. It's something that I have my students do every term at the start of term, so that they can hopefully keep reflecting on this and potentially seeing progress. You guys will have access to that as well. I don't know if anybody had the opportunity to complete it. Are we just looking at it now?
This morning.
Okay. Well, it's not the be-all and end-all of how culturally competent am I, but it's the only actual concrete tool that I've ever encountered. So I think that's helpful. And I encourage you to take a look at it and evaluate from time to time, because remember that these skills are evolving as well. The model that Dunaway and colleagues use for cultural competence is sort of that it's made up of 3 parts. So cultural knowledge, which is essentially what do I know about culture in general, what do I know about my culture and the culture of the other that I'm engaging with. Cultural awareness, so how aware am I of culture kind of knocking on the door and playing a role in the interaction and the relationship, and how are my cultural skills? As behavior analysts, it's where we like to zero in, right? Like, what are my skills? And can I set some goals and achieve greater in terms of my skills? So you have access to the measure, and you have access to the article as well. So I do recommend that you look into that. All right. So you've heard me mention self-awareness probably half a dozen times by now at least. I am going to devote a pretty significant amount of time to this topic, and then we'll go into some sort of practical sorts of experiences, discussions, tips, tricks, etc. But nevertheless, I'm working off of this definition by Burns Holmes, and colleagues. Again, relational frame theory being my position here, is that, as behavior analysts, we like operationalized definitions of things, mentalistic notions. Someone is aware. What does that mean? I like definitions too. But this is very much in keeping with what Skinner said as well. Essentially, self-awareness is simply verbal discrimination of our own behavior. Can I tact what I'm thinking, what I'm doing? Can I do any kind of functional assessment of why that may be? That's where I'm talking about in terms of self-awareness. This is not a magical, intuitive thing. It is a skill set that we can shape. And doing so can enhance our skills of self-observation and self-description regarding our own overt and covert behavior. I think it's very easy for most typically developing adults anyways to say what somebody did, what they did. It's more of a challenge to say, what were you thinking when you did it? How were you feeling when you did it? Those covert experiences require a little bit more practice, and it's ironic because we spend a lot of time, I think, as behavior analysts, in my experience, teaching those with impaired language ability to tact. And when we're able to, we start to try to teach them some of those private events as well. But I don't remember ever really learning about that as a child, in any kind of school anyway, formally, of thinking about thinking, right? So that metacognition piece, that covert behavior, being able to observe what you're thinking, not just report what you did, right? And the recommendation here is that we remain scientifically minded. So ask why, right? A lot of times we act under the assumption that what we did was the right thing to do, and therefore if someone is doing something different, well, they're doing it wrong. But I think being able to ask why from a deterministic standpoint is important, versus just justify, well, I did it because it was the right thing to do. I don't believe in that, well, let's look at that. It's perfectly fine. You can report that you don't believe in something, but where did those thoughts come from? Where did those beliefs come from? And I think, if we keep asking those questions, we might dig back to the notion of these beliefs worked in your context. Maybe they're not working so well anymore. I don't know. They're just questions, but I think they're important. You might not have this in your slides. As early as this morning, there's so much more I can say. I was looking through this book. It's the get out of your mind and into your life. If anyone was there for the RFT talk I did in the summer, I used it quite a lot as well. This is a ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy or training, depending on where you cite Stephen Hayes. As of March, Reno boot camp, he says training, better social validity than therapy. Nevertheless, Stephen Hayes, RFT, ACT, acceptance and commitment training, refers a lot to this ongoing self-awareness. You might hear it called mindfulness. Be careful, because that may or may not be an empirical source, but there is actually an empirical definition of this mindfulness and self-awareness, which is sort of this fluid, continuous knowledge of your own experiences in the present moment. And if we can all work to develop this skill set, my essential message here today is that I think we all, by and large, will increase our cultural competency. Nevertheless, I think when we are in contexts that are novel, new, unusual, uncomfortable, it becomes ever more important that we're paying attention. What am I thinking about this situation? Where did those thoughts come from? How am I feeling? How might those thoughts and feelings influence what I do or don't do? Okay, this might get me in some trouble. I was afraid to include this slide, but I do think that it's important. Of course, the world cannot be divided into this dichotomy of East and West. It's not possible. But there are some behavioral patterns that I've observed and others I've worked with elsewhere have reported. So I'm just going to present this as a guideline, as a starting point. Again, there's nothing here written in stone. These are just observations. May or may not apply to your experiences. That said, my experience was very much of Western dissemination in an Eastern sort of context. If you take the Middle Eastern and India experiences that I had as that sort of Eastern philosophy. And these are some of the differences or observations I might put forth. So I referred a little bit to the policying that seems predominant in the West. I think that comes from a sort of broader, almost like process-oriented approach. That created some conflict for us, especially in the beginning in the Middle East, where showing up to a family's home for a home visit with a bunch of forms, or even just, here's the clinic notes, or here's the progress report. Very structured an approach, very process-oriented approach, whereby a family, Middle Eastern Emirati family welcoming us into their home comes with a lot of cultural and religious implications in terms of how am I greeting you, how am I hosting you. This is important to me, that we are building this relationship. So things like sitting, having tea, some of those social niceties, if you will, were kind of necessary, and we didn't get that right in the beginning. To be completely frank, I think back to some of those earlier parent meetings I held, and I'm talking data, I'm talking about, oh my gosh, like 8 out of 9 or 99% accuracy across 3 consecutive sessions, and this mother is looking at me like, okay, will she be able to talk? I'm like, duh, like now, right? Like, what was I doing? I was doing what I was trained to do, and I was trained to do it in a different context with different sorts of families and cultures and lessons learned, right? I most certainly approached these sorts of meetings much differently than I would have 10 years ago. Kind of playing into that, this sort of like first, next, then, if this, then that, very sort of logical, linear approach to problem solving. I found, and some of my colleagues have found, a little less of that in the Eastern sort of context in which we've engaged. So there was a lot more of sort of larger purpose or meaning abstracted, a lot less specific, and a lot more, this means something. I'll give you a really good example. One of our clinical directors, Pam Osnees, she did her dissertation, her PhD in international psych, and she did her dissertation in cultural things, values. She worked with Emirati mothers, and one of the most heartening things she found, she did a series of interviews, quoted them, etc., was that the mothers, by and large, described their role in the life of their child as being God-given. You know, they were selected to raise these very challenging children because it was the challenge put forth for them by God. And that was something of sort of faith, of meaning, of purpose. So if you're coming to a conversation with a family that believes that this situation they're in is very much ascribed to them from the universe, from God, from whatever spiritual system they may ascribe to. And I'm talking about step 2 in the shaping procedure and how we're going to fade proximity by 2 feet, okay? And you're going to wait 5 seconds to prompt. We're only going to use a partial verbal prompt, and etc., etc., etc. You can see how there can be a disconnect in our conversation. It took me a while to realize why I wasn't clicking with this parent training thing. Like, come on, it's just a partial verbal prompt. We can do this, right? I was coming from a different place, and I had to realize that. And that took time, that took effort, it took a lot of mistakes, it took a lot of learning. But when you're able to meet that same conversation from a place of, this is your purpose, this is your meaning, this is your reason for being, and I want to help you fulfill that. I want to help you see your child succeed. I want to help you overcome your challenge. I'm not talking about shaping step 2, faded proximity, partial verbal prompt. Irrelevant. Like super technically relevant, yes, but in terms of actually getting some sort of connection with this family that is necessary to get treatment integrity, you can't have it without that. Lessons learned. So there's some more here. I think the only one I'm going to really focus in on, because it came up a lot in these conversations I had with friends and colleagues. Timeliness is holiness. I grew up hearing that. But that is not always the case in other cultures. I know that we struggled a lot with that in the Middle East, and my colleague Whitney talks about this in Africa as well. Prompt schedules, not always going to be super appropriate depending on where you're at. Of course, structure and systems are important. We're talking about dissemination here. We're talking about making it work. So a little bit of application. We're got about another half hour to go here. Before proceeding with some specific tips and tools, I just want to mention that it's of course relevant that cultures exist within cultures. So there may be a culture within the organization that is wholly independent of the geographic culture. So I worked with a number of organizations, let's say in Qatar. It's a very small country. Like, I don't know if Canadians can the scope, right? I think it's smaller than PEI, the country itself. Let's put it that way. I'll have to look that up for next time to verify that. Don't quote me. But nevertheless, 3 organizations, completely different cultures in terms of organizational culture, okay? So I want to make that point now that some of the things that I might be saying may or may not fit in terms organizational culture. Aubrey Daniels and colleagues out of ABA talk about when you ask an employee, like, why do you guys do this way? And they just say, well, that's the way we do things around here. That's the kind of culture I'm talking about. It's those unspoken rules of engagement in the workplace, or maybe even the family. Certainly family dynamics will play out differently in different cultures as well. Okay, so some specifics, right, in terms of clinicians. I think it's really important because as BCBAs, we're often writing goals for clients that pertain specifically to the things that those clients do. What do they do too much of? What do they not do enough of, right? Is that child hyperactive, or is that a bias? Maybe they're spirited. Maybe the family is a high energy family. Maybe the culture is a high energy culture. Something to keep in mind, is that child assertive, or is he crossing that line into, speaking his mind a little bit too frequently and a little bit too honestly? These are culturally determined behaviors. So as a BCBA, I can walk in and I can say, he needs to raise his hand no more than twice per 30-minute lesson. Why would I say that? Maybe that comes from what I experienced, which shaped my beliefs of what is appropriate, right? We talk about social appropriateness. Behavioral deficits, it's really interesting actually. I read an article about underdiagnosis in Eastern cultures, under misrepresentation, because social withdrawnness, one of the identifying features, at least in Western cultures, is the child who doesn't speak up much or doesn't talk to other children. That's also culturally relevant. Maybe this child is from a family where, this is not appropriate. He shouldn't be speaking up. There are older people around, and that's not his role in his family. Maybe that's autism, or maybe it's socially appropriate for his context, her context. In terms of the things we're teaching, that's a talk in and of itself, but how appropriate is it that we're teaching this child to do this? I'll just give a quick example. We replicated our Boston preschool model in Abu Dhabi. You guys know, like the circle time, you go around, you sing Days of the Week song, and you read a story. We also did the weather every single day in Boston. We did the weather every single day in Abu Dhabi, and we're like, it's sunny. Every day it's sunny. I remember one day it rained, like once. We ran outside with all the kids and we're like, what's the weather? It's sunny. What have we done? We taught these kids that the weather was sunny. That was like a rote response. Weather, sunny, weather, sunny. There were more important things we should have been teaching besides the weather. In Boston, you need to know if you need your mittens, if you need your rubber boots. You don't need to worry about that in Abu Dhabi. No mittens, no rubber boots, we're good. How appropriate is what we're teaching? Took us a while. Social validity, so is this even important for the culture, for the family? The first classroom I worked in Abu Dhabi was with boys, higher end of the spectrum in terms of functioning, very independent boys who, if they had the behavioral supports that they needed in local schools, would have been there, but didn't, so weren't. They are now, which is great. We faded them back in, I think, all of them. Anyways, just to give you an idea of the clientele, okay? So we're in the kitchen, because this is like a converted house, so that's where we go to eat our lunches, called it the kitchen. And boys finish eating. So we're teaching them to take their plates to the sink, put their trash in a bin, pack up their lunch bags, usual stuff, carry your lunch box back to the classroom. That's what I would have done with any student, anywhere. Until it was brought to my attention that it's not super appropriate for these boys to be doing those kitchen things. Culturally, that is not an expectation for them. They are not asked to clean up their meals. They have maids, they have nannies, and it's not appropriate. And that was a moment of like, I think independence is really important. That's a value. You're telling me he doesn't have to clean up his lunch, even though he's like super capable. I see a conflict here, right? So we had to talk about that. We had to have a space where we can navigate what are the appropriate goals for these boys. And the fact that they're boys is relevant. And that was tricky for me. Wait, so she cleans up her lunch? Okay. Let's talk about this. But again, if we have a community, a space where we can talk about these things from a place of respect and compassion and understanding, we can work it out. Because ultimately, I'm not teaching that young boy how to behave appropriately in Boston. I'm teaching him how to behave appropriately in his family. And that's what's important to all of us. Tricky. Definitely, because you find yourself doing it. All right, time to clean up your lunch. Like, why not? Of course you would, but of course you wouldn't. That's my bias. So I'm going to work through some of those things. And then, of course, it's just preferences. So, eating with your right hand is really important if you're a Muslim. Very important. That's here. My sister's a lefty, and we just teased her about it because she's kind of quirky, and not a big deal though, right? But a really big deal there. Preferences in terms of like reinforcers. Like I couldn't pronounce a lot of the things in the tackle box, so we had to work on that. So these kids are manding, and I don't know what those things are because they're not available in my previous tact history. Tasks, right? Like, so one of the really great things that we did in Abu Dhabi is we were able to get a whole bunch of our curricula added, the Autism Curriculum Encyclopedia, for Islamic relevant skills. So prayer, right? Prayer, super duper important. And this might be a child that has very limited vocal verbal ability, may have severe challenging behavior, but she or he can be taught to put out her prayer mat and engage in the emotions, right? Like, why not? Now this child is a member of their family, whereas before, this was a point of pain. My child doesn't pray. My child doesn't know God, right? Not something I would have thought to teach. Let me tell you that. I had to learn. We had to go through training. How do you go through like wudu in terms of like the Arabic word for like washing, right? Like what is the sequence for doing that? I had to learn. When you enter the bathroom, you exit the bathroom, what are the prayers that are to be said? And that meant for a lot of our little guys, we had Velcro taped strips of the text in Arabic. I couldn't read it, but I taught him or her to point to it. And that was meaningful to that family because now this child is behaving as he should, right? Not according to me, but according to what works for that family. Just some examples. I think, India. Okay, I'll tell you about one of my guys. His name is Avi. He now is 14, 15. Not much in the way of vocal verbal behavior. We were working on the vocational sort of training for him. So pretty severe challenging behavior. Anyway, we wanted to start up like a voc program at East India because a lot of the kids were getting older and that was something we wanted to do. And here I am thinking back to my days in Boston with teenage girls in residential. They all had jobs. They had to as of 14, that was the law. And so we were doing a lot of janitorial. We were doing a lot of like stuffing purses at Walgreens and stuff like that. So I'm thinking, great, Avi would be awesome for like school-wide janitorial stuff. He loves, super social, he loves to go in all the classrooms and say hi, and this will be fun. But like, I didn't realize that in India, having Avi do the sweeping, not okay. Caste system reasons, culturally not okay to ask him to do the sweeping. I wouldn't have known that. You know, I did sweeping with my girls in Boston and, you know, boys too. But these are the kind of preferences related to the things that we're teaching that we don't know unless we ask questions, and we can't assume, and we can't just simply say, well, this is what I've done before, so this is what I'm going to do again. It doesn't necessarily work that way. And I think even if you're not going anywhere or being anywhere else, we're always engaging with people from different backgrounds. So important that we're not like, this is my voc program. I have sweeping, I have kitchen cleanup, I have whatever, right? So how do you come to consensus, maybe, or agreement, or how do you put forth behavioral expectations if, you know, your cultural expectation is different than the family's, and maybe the family doesn't seem to agree either? Is that fair? That's a good question, and I think family dynamics play in everywhere, always. Especially when we're working with, you know, special needs populations. It's a tough thing. In terms of like, you know, navigating that maybe systemically, a couple of the things that we did that were really helpful was we had from the beginning what was called a family liaison role, and that was a locally hired Emirati woman who would come on all the home visits, tell me whether I'm supposed to wear my shoes or not, like, am I supposed to shake this person's hand or not, and also speak Arabic to the mom, and speak English to me, and facilitate trainings for the parents in Arabic, facilitate parents groups, like support groups, so they can be talking with each other about, like, what is your response to these specialists in your home, and how does that work for you? Conversations that I can't have because it's not relevant to me, it's not helpful for them. So I do think you have to look at it not just in terms of like me and this family. Well, that's a good starting point. You know, where am I coming from? Where are they coming from? Where are they individually coming from? If you can have that sort of liaison role where you're involving the community and creating community as well, I do think it takes a team. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
do you end up talking to religious leaders at some points? I mean, did you do that in any of your roles?
I personally wouldn't be the person to do that, at least in that context. As a woman, as a Westerner, as a non-Muslim, but most certainly we had a number of men, Muslim Arab men, who worked on our teams, worked with the kids and worked with the families. Cultural family dynamics were always really interesting, very different. India to Middle East to Africa. So I think understanding, having enough local knowledge and skill set and resources is really important. It was a big part of our program. We started with an 80-20 ratio, 80% Western staff, Americans and me, and then we started to shift that from, I think it's almost reversed at this point. So it was a gradual process of dissemination. It's not like showing up as the expert, my way or the highway, like I'm here to help you. That was never going to work. So it was a very intentional process. And yeah, certain conversations, because of my cultural identity, would have been more or less appropriate than others. So. Okay. I'm gonna have to speed up a little bit. Okay. I think the number one thing that's worked is flexibility, and I'm gonna skip forward because we are gonna talk more about flexibility. We've just talked about the liaison role, and we've talked about scheduling and expectations. I'll share a story real quick. Whitney panel in Ghana was just discussing how they're about to celebrate their 1 year of opening the doors, and she was sharing some of her lessons. And one of the things she realized very quickly, in India, in Boston, and Abu Dhabi, we relied a lot on email. That's just how we communicated to the masses of staff, of parents, whatever. But where she's working now in Ghana, Wi-Fi is not easily accessible, and you have to pay a lot of money to access the internet. So sending emails to her staff was not going to work. Sending emails to parents was not going to work. So asking a staff to take their work home on the weekend, and they don't have a computer, not a reasonable, feasible expectation. So these are the kinds of things we need to consider. Staff trainings in India, I had a all-women staff, all female staff, 20 to 25 years old, I think almost exclusively. And they couldn't stay late because it wasn't safe for them to get home. So we had to play that in. We had to meet, that means organizationally, well, we need professional development, so we need to not have the kids come one afternoon, or we need to take a morning off. And I didn't know that. I was thinking, here's our professional development agenda. Let's set up some after-school trainings. That's what we did everywhere else. Not okay for those staff. So flexibility. In terms of psychological flexibility, this is made up of 3 components. I recently took a training program with Paula Atkins and David Sloan Wilson, and they describe psychological flexibility in terms of intention, awareness, and openness. So as it pertains to this context, my example would be, I will find common ground and connection despite our differences. Awareness, I'm behaving this way in the presence of, and he or she is behaving in this or that way in the presence of that, and that brings to you compassion. And openness. I'm open to experiences which may be uncomfortable. This is the tricky part. Discomfort is a normal response to unfamiliarity. It's really easy to get inside your head. I know, I've done it. What are the rules? What are the things I'm not supposed to do? Is it like left foot first, shake hands, don't shake hands, etc.? But I think we lose touch with our awareness when we're stuck trying to remember all the rules. We're missing what's going on in the environment in terms of the actual contingencies. How is this person responding to me? So here's an ABC model I'll present to you because behavior analysts love their 3-letter acronyms. It's a different ABC though. So the first thing we have to do is we have to accept, right? Accept what is, accept the differences, accept that it's uncomfortable. What are we going to do? We must behave and commit in the interests of our shared values. This notion of values versus goals, I'll try to summarize essentially as saying, it was really kind of insightful for me when I came across this in my research. Especially as behavior analysts, we set a lot of goals. We think goals are the way to succeed. You set a goal, you achieve it. You set another goal, you achieve that. You strive to achieve your goals. You see companies setting multiculturalism goals, whatever that means. However, I think this is more valuable. Values. Values are things that cannot be achieved. Okay, so I can value curiosity, I can value adventure, I can value growth. Those are things you can keep acting in the interest of. You don't get there, it's the journey. Okay, that was a cute little YouTube video if you want to check it out. It's about a kid going to Disneyland, and one kid is focused on the goal, gotta get to Disneyland, keeps complaining, and the other child is excited, right? And they're seeing all this stuff along the way. And I think it relates back to this experience of doing something uncomfortable, of working in a novel sort of situation. Ruiz and Roche define values as guides to help us work through ethical conflicts. So if you don't know what to do, if you don't know what the rule is, think about what your value is, and think about what the family or the staff's value is. What can you do in the interest of that? And that's what brings us to the ACT matrix, which was the exercise I wanted to do with you, and it probably doesn't make sense in your handouts because for some animations. So that's why I want to do this instead of the video. Essentially, the matrix, okay? And I'm going to define the axes here so this makes a little bit more sense. We have, let's do the horizontal one first. Let's say everything going that way is towards. We can move towards things. As organisms, we have the options of moving away or towards or away from things. And then we have this line going this way. Okay? Everything above the horizontal is overt behavior. It's stuff we can see people doing. Everything below that is covert behavior. Another way of looking at this is the stuff we value is covert, unless I tell you. Some examples, when I spoke to my colleagues about this, I want to help this family. That's a thought. Progress, meaningful change, those are my values. I can make a difference. Curiosity, being compassionate, being kind, learning, growth. That's a summary of the values that were shared with me when I had this conversation with my colleagues. And maybe you share some of those, or maybe you have some of your own. You can define those for yourself. This ACT matrix itself is at least a 90-minute training, so I'm flying here. But I appreciate you guys humoring me and keeping up here. On our top right quadrant, we call this engaging. So what are the things we're going to do in the interest of our values? I'm going to attend carefully to parental priorities. I'm going to hold a culture day at work. I'm going to ask respectful questions, remain open. I'm going to say things like, I can see this is really important to you. Those are the overt behaviors acting in the interest of our values. In an ideal world, that's all we'd ever do. But it's not an ideal world, right? So that's when these things come up. Things like, I'm going to say the wrong thing, I'm going to do the wrong thing, I'm doing this wrong. It's a culture clash, I'm so frustrated, this is too hard, we're never going to be able to do this, right? Like, those thoughts happen. They're normal, it's okay. Again, with a behaviorist sort of approach, we don't evaluate why, it's right or wrong that our clients do what they do. They're doing it. What are we going to do about it? We're the same. It's not necessarily bad that you have these thoughts. It's in fact incredibly normal. And so some of the things you might find yourself doing, I need you to change me off this case. I can't work with this family. I don't like working with ... I don't want to talk about this. Those are some overt behaviors that you might do. Paul Atkins and Kevin Polk, who designed the ACT matrix, call these the hooks. Get stuck here, go around and around and around. And meanwhile, forgetting about that stuff. And that's normal. And it's totally something that happens to all of us. I'm sharing it with you in the interest of that self-awareness. What are your hooks, right? That's the question. Where do I get stuck? I get stuck thinking, I can't do this, I'm doing it wrong, therefore I avoid answering those emails because I don't want to mess it up, right? So, are you the boy or the fish? You decide? Okay, real quick, this last bit is practical, so it's it's not very in-depth, so we should finish up on time. Language, obviously, is important, form and function. So is an email or a newsletter going to work? Not if you're in Ghana and a lot of your families are not literate. It's not going to work, right? Which language? Does this family prefer Hindi, English, Thai? Obviously we need to know these things. Also with language, behavior speak. It happens to the best of us. We slip into our professional mode and we speak and we get blank stares because people don't understand what we're saying, and that's not going to help anyone. But also know your audience. If you have a family that is really invested and mom wants to be an RBT and she's training and she's super pumped, a lot of those moms out there, challenge her. You know what I mean? Let her use her skills with you because you're the best person she has to practice with. Consider the function. So if you're asking someone to do something, is it going to work? Is it an effective SD? Or are you speaking behavior speak? Or are you literally providing an SD to a child in English when he could have done it if we gave him the SD in Hindi? That was light bulb, right? Like, oh, he knows how to do this. Are you being yesed? Oh, I could say so much about this. My role in the Middle East, particularly with a family that has got a maid or nanny as the primary caregiver of the child, she gets in trouble if that child screams or cries, and I tell her to engage in extinction. But she loses her job, and she has a family to support in the Philippines and Sri Lanka, somewhere else. I have to realize that the contingencies are selecting that, yes, I understand. Yes, Miss Tiffany, I will do it. Yes, no problem, Miss Tiffany. So, did he have any problem behavior last week? No, he was very good. She's afraid. She's afraid that I'm going to get her in trouble. And unless I can appreciate that context, I'm not going to be effective. There are some problems there, and it's so much easier to say, great, no challenging behavior. Great, she's on board. She said yes. Well, okay, but is she going to do it? And if not, why not? And how can we work within this broader context to make this more effective for everyone? Remember that not all verbal behavior is vocal. Pay attention. You know, how are people responding to you? I think that open awareness, again, comes into play here. Obviously, reinforcement works. Staff, parents, management, you know, this comes into building functional teams, communities, setting measurable goals. What's appropriate? So we had a volleyball team in Abu Dhabi. Beach volleyball. It was great. Except for it wasn't so great for the female staff who weren't comfortable playing beach volleyball with male staff around. Oh, okay. So then, you know, we had a bunch of activities. There's swimming. Swimming on men's days, swimming on female days. There's different sorts of options. Use preference assessment. Everybody likes getting out early on a Thursday. That works. Age as well. So, like, we did a lot of crisis intervention, physical, hands-on movements with our students. Being on the floor with staff, pinning each other down, there's going to be some gender, cultural considerations, clothing considerations. If you're in an abaya, you better have some safety pins, because if you don't have safety pins and your shayla falls off while you're in a protective measure, guess who's breaking that hold, and guess who's not going to get in trouble for that? Because we didn't create a system by which she could feel comfortable engaging in that measure, because now she's not covered, and that is a violation of her moral, religious self. I need to accommodate that, but more so I need to accept that this is what it is, instead of saying, well, you shouldn't do that. You should be on the floor doing the hold because he's engaging in self-injury. That's not going to work. I mean, certainly staff said those things, but it doesn't work. It doesn't change anything for anyone for the better. Of course, there's got to be a balance, right? I said be flexible, but I also heard from my colleagues that a lot of times people report that this structure and this systemic way of doing things that may be Western influenced is helpful to have a schedule of how often are we going to assess, how frequently are we going to do progress reports, how often are the goals updated. It's a balance. Train some more. And policy only where it's appropriate. If you're going to hand someone a 100-page manual and 2 pages will be looked at, probably not, right? There are probably better ways. Function over form. Okay, so by and large, rules equal rigidity, but we do need to know the taboos. What are the dietary restrictions? What are the things we don't talk about? What are the things that are just not going to fly? It's important that you know those things. Who can take that child to the bathroom? Who can go on that home visit? If it's a male staff, can he go? Does he need to go with a female staff, etc.? Be careful with assumption, but also asking is hard and it's sensitive, so be careful who asks, when, and how. What language? Those things make a difference. Celebrate diversity. Obviously, there are challenges. I was looking at this again this morning. None of these are unique to cultural constraints, so I think utilize whatever skills you would use to address these. And this itself is another 90 minutes off. I pulled out all of the code components that relate or have related. I had like a long conversation with my colleagues. We all identified scenarios. That itself is a 90-minute like ethics CE we can talk about. So I'm going to skip through here. This is my why. I think that connection and that compassion overrides culture. It doesn't matter. All of these people you see here mean a lot to me. And I was going to tell you stories, and I was going to play audio from a coffee shop in India, but we don't have time for that. So I'm just going to thank you guys. Really, this has been a really good opportunity and an amazing experience for me to be able to share this with you all. So thank you.